Amidst my father's memorial service, my brother, Kalen, leaned close to my ear, his voice a hiss that reeked of cheap whiskey. Think those tin medals will buy you anything? He's dead. No one is left to protect you now. He secretly aimed his phone at me, waiting for me to crumble. My name is Noli Prent, a lieutenant general in the United States Army. But on that Tuesday, inside the hallowed quiet of the Cathedral of St. Matthew the Apostle in Washington, D.C., I was only a daughter burying her father. The air was thick and heavy, a sacred blend of fragrant white lilies and the ancient scent of old oak pews. High above, the organist played a somber, tender rendition of Amazing Grace, each note meant to soothe the grieving. But I felt no peace. Grief, for me, was a strategic problem to be managed, a perimeter to be secured within my own mind. I sat in the front row, my back ramrod straight, my eyes fixed on the flag-draped casket and the towering marble altar beyond. My focus was absolute, until it was broken. Think those tin medals will buy you anything? A voice hissed into my ear, a venomous whisper that cut through the holy music. He's gone. No one left to protect you now. It was my brother, Kalen. The sour, unmistakable stench of cheap whiskey on his breath was a profound desecration, an insult to the living, the dead, and the sacred space we occupied. It was an act of supreme contempt. A blade of ice slid down my spine. The organ music seemed to warp and fade, replaced by a roaring silence in my ears. In that instant, he was no longer my brother. He was the enemy. My training, honed over decades in the crucible of command, screamed one simple, overriding directive: do not react. A reaction was what the enemy wanted. It was the data they sought, the weakness they hoped to exploit. I did not turn my head. I did not flinch. My gaze remained locked on the golden crucifix, but my mind had already shifted, the gears of my consciousness grinding from a state of mourning to a state of war. I felt a subtle pressure on my left hand. My husband, Corb. Without looking, I knew he had registered the threat. He sat beside me, a 4-star general in his own right, a man whose perception was as sharp as my own. His hand shielded his movement as he slipped his phone into my lap, the screen already lit. The message was stark, typed in the military brevity we both understood. Don't react. Your brother is filming you. My pulse remained steady, a disciplined cadence. I slid my thumb across the screen just once, my fingers typing a single, cold word in reply: sundown. I pressed send. Corb gave a near imperceptible nod, and his fingers squeezed my hand, a silent transfer of strength and confirmation. The order was given. The sundown protocol, our pre-agreed upon contingency for high-threat situations at public events, was now active. It meant internal threat identified, hostile surveillance confirmed, neutralize silently. Instantly, I could feel an invisible network stir around us. The counteroffensive had begun, executed with the clean, lethal precision of a drone strike. The organs swelled, the familiar, powerful chords of Amazing Grace providing perfect cover for a battle being waged without a single gunshot. Throughout the pews, 8 operatives from a special operations unit, all disguised as mourners, began to move with practiced grace. I tracked them with my peripheral vision. A silver-haired woman, who looked for all the world like a retired history teacher from Richmond, Virginia, drifted past a man in a dark suit who was discreetly holding his phone. "Excuse me, sir," she murmured, her voice soft with a southern accent. "I believe you dropped this." As he looked down in confusion, her hand moved in a swift, fluid motion. She placed a folded handkerchief in his hand while her other fingers expertly palmed the recording device from his grip. The exchange took less than 2 seconds. Across the aisle, a young man in a crisp blazer, looking like a junior staffer from the Hill, stumbled forward. His hand, holding a small cup of water from the lobby, tilted just so, spilling its contents directly onto the phone of a woman aiming it from behind a hymn book. "Oh my goodness, I am so terribly sorry," he said, dabbing at her hand with a napkin, his apology effectively blocking her view and disabling her device. They were ghosts. No commotion, no raised voices. They were professionals, neutralizing the assets of an amateur with absolute finality. Then, I saw the checkmate. A tall, distinguished-looking man, one of Corb's most trusted team members, approached Kalen from the side. He leaned in, as if to offer a word of condolence, and whispered something in his ear. I watched as the smug, predatory look on Kalen's face froze. It was replaced by a flicker of confusion, then a wave of stark, wide-eyed panic as his own phone was gently but irrevocably lifted from his hand. He turned his head and stared at me. His eyes, for a brief, unguarded moment, were not filled with hatred, but with the baffled, cornered terror of a child caught in a brazen act of defiance. He had started a firefight and was shocked to find that the other side had guns too. I met his gaze, not as his sister, Noli, but as Lieutenant General Prent, assessing a failed and thoroughly outmaneuvered opponent. I held his stare until he looked away, his face pale and slack. In that moment, seeing the utter collapse on his face, I knew this wasn't just my battle. It was a story so many of us know in our bones. If you have ever felt the cold sting of betrayal from the very person who should have been your shield, press that like button. And tell me in the comments how you found the strength to stand your ground. The threat was neutralized. The enemy was in disarray. But as the last mournful note of the organ faded into the cathedral's vaulted ceiling, a single strategic question lodged itself in my mind, sharper and more painful than any piece of shrapnel. Why? This wasn't a spontaneous act of drunken cruelty. This was a planned operation. This was the opening shot of a war. Why today, in this place of all places? The answer, I knew with chilling certainty, wasn't here in the present. It was buried deep in the past, on a map of scars my own father had helped to draw. Sleep did not come that night. In the profound silence of our Arlington home, I stood before the large bay window in my study, watching the distant, glittering lights of Washington, D.C. reflect off the dark, serpentine surface of the Potomac River. The question from the cathedral, why, was a persistent echo in my mind, a ghost that refused to be still. And as I stood there, the past answered, rising not as a flood, but as a series of precise, painful exhibits. The first memory took me back to a Thanksgiving dinner. I had just returned from my first deployment in Iraq, still carrying the desert dust on my soul. My father, a man who measured affection in units of pride, was holding a copy of a commendation letter I'd received. His voice was loud, booming with a rare, unrestrained joy as he read a passage aloud to the whole family. I remember feeling a warmth spread through my chest, a fleeting sense of arrival. Then came Kalen's voice, sharp and dismissive, slicing through the warmth. He was on his third Sam Adams, and the beer had unlocked his usual bitterness. "Oh, a war hero," he sneered, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. He raised his bottle in a mock toast. "Congratulations, sis. You've mastered the art of following orders, but in the real world, where people use their brains to make money, not just their muscles, you think you'd last a single day." The words stung, but what truly wounded me was the silence that followed. My father's booming voice fell quiet. He folded the letter, his gaze dropping to the table. He said nothing, not a single word of defense. He just moved on, asking someone to pass the mashed potatoes. In his silence, Kalen's insult became a verdict. The message was clear. My world, my sacrifices, were lesser. They were not worthy of a fight at the family dinner table. I felt a profound sense of loneliness, an invisible wall rising between my father and me. The second memory was colder, sharper. It was the day my acceptance letter to West Point arrived. It was a monumental achievement, a gateway to the life I had always envisioned. But Kalen saw it as a declaration of war on his own sense of self. He snatched the newspaper that had printed my name in a small local announcement and threw it down on the kitchen counter. The paper slid across the granite, a flimsy testament to my triumph. "You really want to live the life of a man, don't you?" he said, his voice dripping with a contempt that felt like acid. "Short hair, screaming on some drill field. It's pathetic. You'll never find a man who can handle a wife who's more of a man than he is." His words were a slow-acting poison, designed to seep into the core of my identity, to attack my very womanhood. For years, that poison worked. It created a flicker of doubt, a quiet insecurity that I had to fight just as fiercely as any enemy on the field. It was a scar I carried, hidden beneath my uniform. It was only years later that I met Corb, a man strong enough to see the general and the woman, and love them both without condition, without fear. He saw the scar and didn't try to hide it. He honored it as part of the map of who I was. And then, the final memory, the one that echoed with a tragic, prophetic clarity. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon. My father and I were in his study, polishing his old military memorabilia. He was a Marine, a veteran of the Vietnam War, and these objects were his sacred texts. He picked up his own Purple Heart, the metal cool and heavy in his palm. He looked at me. His eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with a deep, weary wisdom. "Noli," he said, his voice low and serious. "Remember this. Not every enemy wears a different uniform. Sometimes they share your blood. And the wounds they inflict, they hurt more than any bullet ever could." I had dismissed it then, attributing it to the melancholy that sometimes claimed him, a father's overprotective sentiment. But now, standing by the window, his words returned not as a memory, but as a prophecy fulfilled. He had seen it. He had known the fault lines in his own family, the latent hostility in his own son. He had tried to warn me, and I hadn't listened. That realization didn't break me. The grief for the warning I'd ignored, the anger at the injustice I'd endured, the profound sadness for the family I wished we could have been, all of it coalesced. The heat of my anger from the cathedral did not dissipate. It was forged into something colder, harder. It became steel. I am not the only one who has had to learn this lesson in the hardest way possible. There's a unique pain that comes from being the one who tries, the one who achieves, only to be torn down by the one who feels left behind. If this story resonates with that quiet battle you've fought in your own family, share a "me too" in the comments. You are not alone in this. I turned from the window, the map of my past laid bare. The old wounds were not weaknesses to be mourned. They were strategic intelligence, data points that clarified the nature of the enemy and the stakes of the battle. He would not desecrate our father's legacy. He would not win. I walked to my desk. The cherry wood cool beneath my fingertips. I opened my government-issued laptop, the quiet hum a familiar sound of purpose. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a new, unshakable resolve. I started a new email. Subject: Legacy Protection, Urgent Request. The email was addressed to a single recipient, the director of the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The battle had truly begun. A few days after the funeral, a fragile truce settled over my spirit. Guided by an instinct older than strategy, I decided to make a peace offering. I spent the afternoon in my kitchen, the warm scent of vanilla and melting chocolate filling the air. I was baking chocolate chip cookies from my mother's old, handwritten recipe card, the edges softened and stained from years of use. It was something she would have done. It was something my father would have wanted, an attempt to mend a tear in the family fabric with a simple act of care. With the warm container of cookies on the passenger seat, I drove my sedan out of Arlington and headed toward McLean, Virginia. The perfectly manicured lawns and stately brick houses of my brother's neighborhood stood in stark contrast to the disciplined austerity of my own life. This was Kaylin's world, a world measured in square footage and stock portfolios. As I pulled into his driveway, a foolish, fragile hope began to form within me. Perhaps the confrontation at the cathedral was an aberration, a moment of drunken grief. Perhaps, for the sake of the next generation, a bridge could still be built. I was a fool to hope. Kaylin wasn't home, but the nanny let me in. His daughter, my 8-year-old niece, Alara, was in the living room, building a tower with a colorful mountain of Legos. The room, like the rest of the house, was immaculately decorated but felt cold, impersonal. Ilara's bright laughter was the only source of warmth. I left the cookies on the marble countertop and sat down on the floor with her, the plush white rug cool beneath my knees. For a while, there was only the satisfying click of plastic bricks and the easy chatter of a child explaining the vital importance of a blue Lego over a red one. In that simple, shared act of creation, I felt a flicker of what family was supposed to be. It was a peaceful, sunlit moment, just before the ambush. As we placed the final piece on our teetering tower, Alara looked up at me, her wide, clear eyes holding the guileless sincerity that only a child possesses. "Aunt Noli," she asked, her voice small and earnest, "is it true? Are you going to sell all of Grandpa's metals to buy a new car?" The air left my lungs. The question didn't just land, it detonated. It felt like a physical blow, an electric shock that jolted up my spine and made the world tilt on its axis. The colorful Lego tower blurred before my eyes. I struggled to form words, my throat suddenly tight. "What? Sweetie, who told you that?" "Daddy did," she replied, with the simple, unwavering honesty of a child relaying a fact. "He said you don't care about those things, that you only care about your job at the Pentagon. He said Grandpa would be very sad." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was one thing to be insulted to my face. It was another to have a lie so poisonous, so fundamentally false, be delivered by a messenger so pure. Kalen had weaponized his own daughter's innocence. He had turned her into a delivery system for his own venom. Alara wasn't finished. She pointed a small finger toward her own chest. "Daddy also said the one with the purple heart is worth the most money," she continued, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to recall the lesson. "And that you would sell that one first. He said that's the one you get for being brave and getting hurt at the same time." A red-hot anger, fierce and absolute, surged through me. This was his true crime. He wasn't just attacking me. He was poisoning his daughter's mind. He was taking our father's legacy, a legacy of honor, sacrifice, and courage, and reducing it to a price tag. He was twisting the sacred symbol of my father's wound into a tool for his own petty, dirty game. I looked at Alara's innocent face, waiting for my answer, and the soldier in me took command of the sister. My own pain was irrelevant. The mission was to protect the child. I took a slow, deliberate breath, pushing the rage down, locking it away. I knelt down so I was at her eye level. "Oh, sweetie, no," I said, my voice gentle but firm, steadying the world for her again. "That's not true at all. Medals aren't for selling. They're for remembering. They're stories. Each one tells a story about what a brave and wonderful man your grandpa was. They are meant to be protected, to be honored." I smiled, hoping it reached my eyes. "Next time you come over, I promise I'll show you the real Purple Heart, and I'll tell you the whole story behind it. It's a very important one." She seemed satisfied with that, her small face brightening as she turned her attention back to the Lego tower. I stayed a few more minutes, then said my goodbyes, the warmth of the fresh-baked cookies on the counter feeling like a mockery. I made it to my car before the tremors started. I sat in the sterile silence of the driver's seat and looked down at my hands. They were shaking. Not from fear, but from a rage so profound it had become a physical force. The last, fragile thread of hope for reconciliation had not just been cut, it had been incinerated. I pulled out my phone. My first instinct was to call Corb, to seek his strength and comfort. But I stopped. This was beyond comfort. This required action. I scrolled past his name and found the number for our family's longtime attorney. I took one more deep, grounding breath. When I spoke, my voice was as steady and cold as stone. "I need to see you," I said, dispensing with any pleasantries. "Immediately." I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle, a declaration from which there was no retreat. "It's about my father's estate. Kalen has crossed every line." This was no longer a defensive maneuver to protect a legacy. It was now an offensive operation to contain a threat. My brother had made it clear he would stop at nothing. And I would show him what nothing truly looked like. I drove home from the lawyer's office with a cold knot of dread in my stomach. Our house in Arlington, usually a sanctuary of quiet order, now felt like a forward operating base, a fortress preparing for a siege. The familiar comfort of its walls was laced with a new, chilling sense of vulnerability. Corb was waiting for me in his study. He had turned off the television, sparing me the noise of the outside world. The only light came from the soft, warm glow of a single desk lamp, casting long shadows across the bookshelves. He didn't press me with questions. He simply rose from his leather armchair and handed me a steaming mug. Earl Grey tea, with a sliver of lemon and no sugar. Exactly how I liked it. He knew my rituals, the small comforts that anchored me in a storm. "I'm here," he said. The three simplest words in the English language, yet in his mouth, they were an oath, a fortress wall of their own. He wrapped his arms around me, and for the first time since my father's funeral, I let myself tremble. The immense weight of my uniform, of the stars on my collar, of a lifetime of disciplined composure, seemed to dissolve. In the circle of his arms, I wasn't Lieutenant General Prent, Deputy Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. I was just Noli, a woman whose heart was breaking, a woman facing a betrayal so profound it threatened to shatter her foundations. This was my chosen family, the one forged not by blood, but by unwavering, unconditional trust. We stood like that for a long time, the silence broken only by the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. When my breathing had steadied, when the tremors had subsided, he gently led me to the chair opposite his desk. On the polished wood surface lay a single, thin file folder. It was bright red, the color of danger. "I asked a few friends at the DIA to do some quiet digging after the incident at the cathedral," Corb said, his voice low and grave. "This is what they found." I opened the folder. The contents were a clinical, chilling anatomy of a conspiracy. My stomach tightened with each page I turned. Kaylin had hired a private investigation firm 3 months ago. They had been following me. Photographers, surveillance logs. He had compiled a dossier of his own, filled with half-truths and out-of-context pictures, designed to paint a portrait of a high-ranking officer cracking under pressure. The next section contained a list of contacts. He had been shopping his story to tabloid journalists, the kind of bottom feeders who would print anything for a price. The narrative he was peddling was sickeningly clear: a mentally unstable female general, unfit for command, a threat to national security. This wasn't about the inheritance. This was never just about money. This was an assassination. His goal was the total annihilation of my career, my reputation, and the very legacy he claimed to revere. It was a betrayal on a scale I couldn't have imagined. My brother, my own blood, was actively trying to destroy me. I turned to the final page, a summary of key personnel involved, and a name leaped out at me, a name from a past I thought I had buried in the dust of Afghanistan. Rexford Rex Thorne. The name hit me like a physical impact. The study around me faded, and for a moment, I was back in the heat and grit of Kandahar. Major Rex Thorne. He had been a sharp officer, ambitious, talented, but with a reckless arrogance that saw rules as mere suggestions. He had falsified the readiness reports for his unit, lying about equipment maintenance and troop fitness, all to ensure his team was chosen for a high-profile assault mission. I was his commanding officer. I discovered the deception during a final review, hours before the operation was set to launch. I pulled his unit from the mission on the spot. My decision saved the lives of at least a dozen soldiers who would have gone into combat with faulty equipment. It also earned me an enemy for life. Thorne was disciplined, his career derailed. He eventually left the army in disgrace, his ego shattered. And now, here he was, allied with my brother. I stood up and walked to the bookshelf, my eyes finding the familiar, stern portrait of General George S. Patton. My father had hung it there years ago. I could almost hear my father's voice reciting one of his favorite Patton quotes, a mantra he had repeated to me countless times before deployments. I whispered it to myself now, the words a lifeline in the swirling chaos of my thoughts. Accept the challenges so that you can feel the exhilaration of victory. The words settled my racing heart. They refocused my mind. This was no longer a messy, emotional family feud. The battlefield had changed. My opponent wasn't just my jealous, floundering younger brother. It was a strategic partnership. Kaylin provided the motive and the intimate knowledge of my vulnerabilities. Thorne provided the professional expertise in deceit and a burning personal desire for revenge. He understood the machinery of the Pentagon. He knew how to weaponize information, how to turn public perception into a battlefield. I turned back to Corb. He was watching me, his expression calm and steady, waiting for my lead. He saw the shift in my eyes the moment the grieving daughter receded and the commander returned. The steel was back in my spine. "All right," I said, my voice sharp once more, stripped of all tremor, all doubt. "The real battle begins now." 2 weeks later, I received an invitation. The family lawyer, a man whose firm had served my parents for 40 years, was calling a meeting. The stated purpose was to encourage reconciliation and begin a preliminary discussion about our father's will. The chosen venue was a private room at the Capitol Grill in Georgetown, a place known for its dark wood paneling, expensive steaks, and the quiet brokering of power deals. I knew with every fiber of my being that it was a trap. But it was a trap I had to walk into. Refusing to attend would be seen as an admission of guilt, a confirmation of the instability Kaylin was so eager to prove. I walked into the room wearing my civilian clothes, a simple, well-tailored black dress, but I felt as though I were in full combat gear. The air was thick with a cloying cordiality, a strained veneer of civility stretched thin over a chasm of resentment. Kaylin was the perfect picture of a concerned younger brother. He pulled out my chair, asked about my work at the Pentagon with a look of feigned interest. His eyes, however, held a cold, predatory gleam. My aunts, uncles, and cousins were scattered around the large circular table. They greeted me with brief, nervous smiles before their gazes quickly darted back down to their water glasses or bread plates. They were neutral parties, terrified of being caught in the crossfire. In that room, surrounded by my own blood, I had never felt more alone. The small talk was excruciating. The weather, the stock market, the latest political gossip. All of it felt like the meaningless chatter of a countdown clock, ticking toward a pre-planned detonation. It came, as I knew it would, during the main course. The conversation had turned to business, a topic on which Kaylin considered himself an expert. He waited for a lull in the conversation, then turned to me, a theatrical, pitying smile playing on his lips. He raised his voice just enough for the entire table to hear. "You know, Noli has always been a brilliant strategist," he began, the words dripping with condescension. "She can move battalions around on a map at the Pentagon like it's a game of chess. An absolute master of the theoretical." He paused, letting the insult hang in the air. "But give her a tech startup in Silicon Valley, a real business with real payroll and real risk. I'm not so sure she'd survive the first quarter." He laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. "The real world is a lot tougher, isn't it?" The room fell silent. Utterly, completely silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Every eye at the table, including the nervous ones, darted toward me, waiting. They were waiting for the explosion, the righteous anger, the furious rebuttal they felt I was entitled to. They were waiting for the show Kaylin had orchestrated. I did not give it to them. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my fork and knife down on my plate, the porcelain making a soft, definitive click. I picked up my water glass, took a small, measured sip, and then placed it back on the coaster with perfect precision. Then, and only then, did I lift my head and look directly at my brother. I held his gaze, my expression calm, neutral, almost bored. And I said nothing. My silence was a weapon. It was a shield he could not penetrate and a statement more powerful than any words I could have uttered. It said, "You are not my peer. Your opinion is irrelevant. This game you are playing is so far beneath me, I will not even deign to acknowledge it." I saw the flicker of frustration in his eyes. His smug smile faltered. He had thrown his sharpest dart, and it had bounced off harmlessly. I glanced to my left. Corb was looking at me, his face impassive, but his eyes conveyed a clear message. "Excellent work. Hold the line." That silent exchange was my reinforcement. It was all I needed. In that moment of quiet defiance, I had won the engagement. The rest of the dinner passed in a haze of awkward, stilted conversation. Kaylin didn't try another attack. He had lost his nerve. We were the first to leave. As soon as the doors of the private room closed behind us, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. In the hushed, carpeted hallway, a corp took my hand. We didn't speak until we were in the car, the engine a low hum in the quiet of the parking garage. The sting of the public humiliation was still fresh, a dull ache in my chest. Then Corb reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small black USB flash drive. He dropped it into my open palm. It felt cool and solid. One of my guys was at the table next to us, he explained, his voice calm. Posing as a lobbyist, he had a clear shot. My eyes widened. A clear shot? This, he said, tapping the USB drive, is a high-fidelity audio recording of the entire dinner conversation, and, for good measure, a short video clip from the restaurant's own security camera, showing Kalen's face right after he delivered his little speech. I stared at the small piece of plastic and metal in my hand. The nature of the evening shifted. The humiliation was no longer just a wound to be nursed. It was now evidence. It was ammunition. It was a tactical asset. Kalen, in his blinding arrogance and desperate need to perform for an audience, had just handed me the very weapon I needed for the next phase of the war. He had walked right into my sights and delivered his own confession. The next evening, the chill from the lawyer's office had not yet dissipated when Corb's team delivered their full report. They had been ruthlessly efficient, their actions a silent testament to the competence I'd come to rely on. Not only had they flawlessly neutralized the surveillance assets at the cathedral, but in the quiet aftermath, they had also recovered one of the burner phones from a low-level operative Kalen had hired for the day. The phone, incredibly, was unlocked. A rookie mistake, a sign of Kalen's amateurish delusion that he was playing in the major leagues. Corb came into my study later that night, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a grim tension that tightened the lines around his eyes. He held a small black USB drive, identical to the one from the restaurant, but this one felt infinitely heavier, radiating a coldness that seemed to lower the temperature of the room. "No, Lee," he said, his voice quiet but intense, a tone he reserved for the most critical intelligence. "My team found something on the recovered phone, a voice memo. It was recorded 2 hours before the funeral, in a cheap motel room on the outskirts of the city, near the cathedral." He placed the drive on the polished surface of my desk. It lay there like a tiny black coffin. "You need to hear this. Alone." His words hung in the air, a clear and ominous warning. He knew I had to face this particular enemy without reinforcements. This was my ground zero. He gave my shoulder a firm, prolonged squeeze, a silent transfer of his strength to me, and then left, closing the heavy oak door softly behind him. I was left in the profound silence, the only sounds the steady ticking of the grandfather clock and the frantic thumping of my own heart. My hand was surprisingly steady as I picked up the drive and plugged it into my laptop. I put on my noise-canceling headphones, a familiar ritual before any critical analysis, creating a sterile bubble of silence to insulate me from the world. My finger hovered over the trackpad for a moment before I navigated to the single audio file. I clicked play. The recording was nauseatingly clear. The background was filled with the cheap, tinny sounds of a low-budget motel room, the wheezing hum of a window air conditioner, the distant, muffled rumble of highway traffic. Then, Kalen's voice filled my ears, and a physical chill, sharp and invasive, snaked its way down my spine. It was a voice I had never truly heard before. It was completely devoid of emotion, stripped of the performative grief he had worn so convincingly at the funeral. This was his true voice, cold, clinical, and ruthlessly calculating. He was giving instructions to someone, one of his hired hands. "I don't need her crying," Kalen said, his tone sharp, impatient, as if discussing a poorly performing asset. "Crying is too normal. It's expected, sympathetic. I need anger. I need her to yell, to lose control. We just need to capture that one moment, the moment the general's mask cracks." He paused, and I could hear the faint clink of ice cubes against a glass, a sound of casual cruelty that made my blood run cold. "Look, people don't remember the whole story. They remember the picture you give them, the soundbite. And I want the picture to be of an unstable leader. I want the Pentagon to see her as unstable. That's the narrative. That's the product. A different voice, rougher, asked a hesitant question. What if she doesn't react? I heard she's got a reputation for being made of ice. Kaylin laughed. It was a horrifying sound, dry and reptilian, completely without humor or warmth. It was the sound of pure predatory amusement. Oh, she'll react, he said with absolute, chilling confidence. I know my sister's weakness. It's not her career, it's not the money. It's our father's honor. I'm going to poke her right there. I'm going to use his memory to break her. I ripped the headphones from my head as if they were on fire, throwing them onto the desk. The sound of my own ragged breathing filled the silent room. A violent wave of nausea, acrid and overwhelming, rose in my throat. I leaned forward, bracing my hands on the cool wood of the desk, fighting the physical urge to be sick. It was over. The war inside me was over. Any last, microscopic shred of hope, any lingering, sentimental fantasy that this was all just a manifestation of petty jealousy. A stupid, misguided cry for attention from a brother lost in my shadow. It all dissolved, burned away by the acid of his words. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't grief-fueled anger. This was pure, unadulterated malice, meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed. This was a character assassination, a cold-blooded conspiracy. He was willing to desecrate our father's memory, the very thing he accused me of disrespecting, as a calculated tool to ruin me. The pain that followed was immense, a white-hot agony that threatened to incinerate me from the inside out. But in the crucible of that pain, something else was forged. The anger and the hurt didn't explode into tears or screams of rage. They didn't make me weak. They compressed. They superheated and then flash froze, hardening into something new. Something cold, solid, and lethally dangerous. I stood up from my desk, my movements no longer tired or hesitant, but sharp and precise, imbued with a terrible new purpose. I walked to the heavy steel safe hidden behind a bookshelf, spun the dial with practiced institutional familiarity, and pulled the door open. I placed the new USB drive inside, alongside the one from the restaurant and the red DIA file. A trinity of evidence. I closed the heavy door, the solid thud of the bolt locking into place echoing the finality of my decision. There was no going back. My gaze fell upon the formal portrait on my wall. A picture of me in my dress uniform, the flag of the United States of America, a field of stars and stripes behind me. I looked into the eyes of the woman in the photograph. I was no longer fighting for myself. I wasn't even fighting solely for my father's legacy anymore. This had become bigger than that. I was fighting for the uniform itself, for the honor it represented, for every single soldier, male or female, who had ever trusted me, followed me into harm's way, and believed in the integrity of my command. He had not just attacked Noli Prent, he had attacked a lieutenant general of the U.S. Army. And that was a declaration of war he was not prepared to win. I picked up the secure line on my desk, my fingers dialing my lawyer's number from memory. He answered on the second ring. My voice, when I spoke, held no trace of the woman who had trembled in her husband's arms just the night before. It was the voice of a commander on the eve of battle. Clear, unwavering, and absolute. We have enough, I said. Prepare for war. The days that followed were a whirlwind of strategic preparation. My lawyer's conference room, with its mahogany table and views of the Potomac, was transformed into a veritable war room. A large whiteboard dominated one wall, covered in a complex web of evidence, timelines, and legal precedents. We had the voice memo from the motel, our smoking gun. We had the audio and video from the Capitol Grill. We had Kaylin's precarious financial records, showing a man desperate for an infusion of cash. We had sworn affidavits from the operatives who had witnessed the coordinated surveillance at the funeral. The case was strong, a fortress of facts. And yet, as I stood before that board, I felt a nagging sense of incompleteness. There was a missing piece to the puzzle. Our evidence could prove what Kaylin did, and the financial records could suggest why. But it couldn't fully explain the depth of his malice, the sheer, self-destructive poison that drove him. To win this war decisively, I didn't just need to defeat Kaylin. I needed to understand the battlefield of his mind. The answer, I realized, didn't lie in more surveillance or financial forensics. It lay in memory. The next morning, I drove to Old Town Alexandria, to a small, quiet coffee shop with cobblestone streets outside its windows. I was meeting Serafina Sarah Gallo, my mother's best friend. She was a woman with kind eyes and a memory as sharp as a tack, a living library of my family's history. She had held me as a baby and watched Kalen take his first steps. He was always the forgotten one, Sarah said, stirring her cappuccino, her voice gentle but clear. Or at least, that's how he felt. She told me things I'd been too busy or too self-involved to see. She spoke of how, when I received my first medal, Kalen, who had just closed his first small business deal, received only a brief, distracted pat on the back from our father. When my face was in the local paper for a promotion, Dad had proudly cut out the article and taped it to the refrigerator door. Kalen's small business successes were met with a simple, "That's nice, son." Your father loved you both, Noli, fiercely, Sarah explained, her eyes full of a sad wisdom. But he was a soldier. He only knew how to speak the language of a soldier's pride, medals, ranks, tangible achievements. He didn't know how to praise the quieter victories of a civilian son. Kalen never understood that. His wound isn't from a lack of love. It's from a lifetime of feeling unseen, of craving a validation that his father didn't know how to give. Sarah's words didn't excuse Kalen's actions. There is no excuse for such cruelty. But they provided the missing piece: motive. A motive born of a deep, festering wound of perceived inadequacy. He wasn't just trying to get money, he was trying to burn down the monument he felt he could never measure up to: me. And with that understanding came a new, cold strategic idea. The enemy of my enemy could be my friend. If Rex Thorne was Kalen's partner in this, a man driven by his own humiliated pride, then it stood to reason he had left a trail of other victims. He wouldn't have changed his methods. I put Corb's intelligence team to work. They scoured old service records, military forums, and social networks, searching for anyone who had filed a complaint or suddenly left the service after a tour with Thorne. It took them less than 48 hours. They found a name: Anya Sharma. A former captain in Army intelligence, sharp as a whip. Her career had been on a fast track to promotion until she served under Thorne. After she rejected his unwelcome advances, he began a quiet, insidious campaign against her. He spread rumors about her competence, questioned her judgment in reports, and sabotaged a critical project she was leading. She was investigated. Though cleared of any wrongdoing, the damage was done. Her reputation was tarnished, her momentum stalled. She left the Army a year later, another silent casualty of a toxic leader. I made a decision. This wasn't a task for a lawyer. This required a personal touch. The next day, I drove north to Baltimore. I found Anya Sharma working as a senior logistics manager for a large shipping company, her office overlooking the bustling port. I had left my uniform at home. I walked in not as a general, but as a woman who understood the sting of injustice. She was wary at first, her eyes guarded as I introduced myself. She had built a new life, and I was a ghost from a past she had tried to bury. I know what Rex Thorne did to you, I said simply, getting straight to the point. I've seen the records, and I need you to know that he's doing it again. He's allied with my brother, and they are trying to destroy my career using the same playbook of lies and rumors he used on you. I saw a flicker of old pain in her eyes. I held up a hand. I am not here to ask you to testify. I am not asking you to dredge up a past that cost you so much. I am here to tell you that you are not alone, and to promise you that this time, he will not get away with it. Anya was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the ships moving slowly in the harbor below. I could see a decade of buried anger and frustration churning within her. When she finally turned to look at me, the guardedness in her eyes was gone. It had been replaced by a hardened, glittering resolve. I'll testify, she said, her voice low, but infused with a strength that sent a shiver down my spine. She looked me directly in the eye. Not for you, General. For me. I nodded, a profound sense of respect and gratitude washing over me. I had found my weapon, not a piece of paper, Not a recording, but something far more powerful. A living, breathing weapon of truth, with a story forged in the same fire as my own. Thorne had no idea what was coming. The attack came without warning. It was a Tuesday morning. I was in the middle of a high-level briefing at the Pentagon, discussing logistical challenges for our forces in Eastern Europe. The room was sterile, windowless, the air humming with the quiet efficiency of national security. Suddenly, my aide's phone, set to silent, began to vibrate against the polished conference table, a frantic, insistent buzzing that refused to stop. He shot me an apologetic look and glanced at his screen. I saw the color drain from his face. He leaned over and whispered, his voice tight with alarm, "General, you need to see this, now." He slid the phone in front of me. And there it was. A 15-second video, already rocketing across Twitter, Facebook, and every military forum imaginable. The video was a masterpiece of malicious artistry. It showed a woman who looked exactly like me, standing in what appeared to be my office. I, or the digital puppet bearing my face, was holding my father's Purple Heart. The lighting was dim, casting my features in a harsh, unflattering light. The camera zoomed in as my hand, with cold indifference, dropped the metal into a trash can. Then came the audio, a voice that was mine, yet chillingly devoid of my soul. An AI-generated clone that said with flat disdain, "It's just a useless piece of metal." My mind raced, trying to deconstruct the lie. I recognized the clip of me holding the metal. It was from a private family video taken years ago when I was showing it to Alara. The clip of me dropping something into the trash was from a recent office cleanup day, tossing out old paperwork. But Thorne's digital butchers had stitched them together, creating a seamless, horrifying fiction. To the millions of people who would see it, it was real. The firestorm erupted instantly. My aide's phone was just the first tremor of the earthquake. Within minutes, the digital world was ablaze. The hashtags were brutal, designed for maximum damage. Disgraced general. Stolen honor. They spread like a virus. Veterans groups, men and women I'd served with and for, released statements of outrage. Politicians from the opposing party, smelling blood in the water, called for an immediate investigation into my fitness for command. And the comments? The comments were a tidal wave of hatred. "Traitor! She spits on every soldier's grave, unfit to wear the uniform. Strip her of her rank and dishonorably discharge her." Each word was a physical blow. I felt the air being sucked from my lungs. The briefing room, with its maps and charts, felt like a distant, irrelevant planet. My world had shrunk to the glowing screen in front of me, a portal to my own public execution. Corp's team confirmed my worst fears within the hour. The video hadn't just gone viral. It had been strategically seeded and amplified by a network of bot accounts and anonymous influencers, all traced back to shell corporations linked to Rex Thorne's law firm. This wasn't a random outburst. This was a nuclear strike on my honor, my career, and my soul. I excused myself from the briefing and returned to my office. I sat behind my desk, the door closed, and watched the world burn. The phone on my desk rang incessantly. Emails flooded my inbox. The digital walls were closing in, the noise of the mob growing louder with every passing second. I felt a profound sense of powerlessness, a feeling I hadn't experienced since I was a young lieutenant pinned down by enemy fire. I had dedicated my entire adult life to serving this country, to protecting its people. And now, those very people were tearing me to shreds, sharpening their pitchforks based on a lie fabricated by my own brother and his sociopathic partner. The door to my office opened. It was General Mark Allen, the Army Chief of Staff, my direct superior. He was a stern, weathered man who had seen combat in 3 different decades. He walked in, his face an unreadable mask, and my heart sank. This was it. The end. He didn't speak. He walked over to the coffee machine in the corner, poured a fresh cup into a clean mug, and placed it on my desk in front of me. "I know this is a hit job, Noli," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "It's a classic information warfare tactic. Vile, but effective." He looked me straight in the eye. "Don't let it break you. We've seen your file. We know who you are. The army stands with you. Do what you need to do to fight this. His words were a lifeline. In the midst of the hurricane, his simple act of trust, of faith, was an anchor. It didn't stop the pain, but it stopped the freefall. The support from the institution I had given my life to was the shield I needed. But my strategy had to be perfect. Kaylin and Thorne were waiting for me to panic. They wanted a tearful press conference, a frantic denial. They wanted me to engage them on their chosen battlefield, the chaotic, emotional theater of social media. They wanted me to scream my innocence into the storm. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I sat there, the hot coffee mug warming my cold hands, and I began to think like a commander again. You cannot reason with a firestorm. You cannot debate with a digital mob. You can only cut off its oxygen. You have to change the terrain, force the enemy onto your ground, a place where their weapons are useless. The stage for our counterattack would not be Twitter or Facebook. It would be a place where lies wither under oath and truth, cold and hard, has the final, unassailable word. A courtroom. And the timing would be everything. Not in weeks, not in days. It would be at the upcoming public ceremony to dedicate my father's artifacts to the Army Heritage and Education Center. We would turn their greatest weapon, public opinion, against them. The civil hearing convened on a crisp autumn morning. The courtroom was a theater of polished wood and solemn silence, a stage where truth and lies would finally go to war under the sworn sanctity of the law. I sat beside my lawyer, my posture erect, my expression neutral. Across the room, at the opposing table, sat Kaylin and Rex Thorne. They were whispering to each other, sharing a confident smirk. They looked at me with an air of triumphant pity, certain that I had come armed with nothing more than weak denials and emotional pleas. They had fundamentally misjudged their opponent. My lawyer, a calm, methodical man named Mr. Davies, began the proceedings not with a fiery opening statement, but with the quiet, devastating precision of a surgeon. One by one, he laid out the evidence. First, he played the audio from the motel room. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman, listened intently through her own set of headphones, her expression hardening with every chilling word Kaylin spoke. The smug look on my brother's face began to falter. Next, Davies presented the forensic analysis of the viral video, prepared by a top cyber forensics expert from the NSA. The report was displayed on the large screens in the courtroom, detailing with clinical precision the digital seams, the audio manipulation, the AI-generated voice print. The video was officially declared a deepfake. Thorne's confident smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. Then, Davies called his first witness, the lead archivist from the Army Heritage and Education Center. The man testified under oath that my father's full collection of medals, including the Purple Heart, had been received and secured in their climate-controlled vault 2 weeks before the fake video had ever appeared online. They had never been in my possession to be thrown away. With each new piece of evidence, I watched the confidence drain from Kaylin and Thorne's faces. The smirks were long gone, replaced by the pale, clammy look of men realizing their fortress was built on sand, and the tide was coming in. For our final witness, Mr. Davies announced, his voice steady, "We call former Army Captain Anya Sharma." The name hung in the air for a moment. I saw Rex Thorne flinch as if he'd been struck. His face, already pale, turned a sickly shade of gray. He knew he was finished. Anya walked to the witness stand with a calm, unshakable dignity. She looked directly at Thorne, her gaze holding no fear, only a cold, righteous anger. She told her story. She spoke of his harassment, of the lies he had spread, of the career he had systematically destroyed because she had refused him. Her voice never wavered. "His methods have not changed," Anya concluded, turning her powerful gaze to the judge. "He finds what he perceives as a person's weakness, and he attacks it with lies and innuendo until they break. He did it to me, and he tried to do it to General Prent. I am here today to say, on the record, that he will not get away with it again." Her testimony was devastating. It didn't just support my case, it annihilated Rex Thorne's character, exposing him as a predatory, vindictive coward. The courtroom was silent, the weight of her truth palpable. Just as the judge was preparing to hear closing arguments, a strange thing happened. A court officer approached our table and indicated that someone wished to see me. It was Sarah Gallo. She rushed in, her face etched with a frantic urgency, and pressed a thick manila envelope into my hands. "From Kalen," she whispered. "He gave it to me this morning. He said he was sorry." I opened the envelope. Inside was a small USB drive and a handwritten note on a piece of hotel stationery. The handwriting was messy, panicked. I hired them. Thorne planned it. I was wrong. Use this. Don't protect me anymore. Tucked inside the note was something else. A crude, childlike crown fashioned from purple construction paper. On it, written in Alara's looping, 8-year-old scrawl, were the words, "For a brave aunt." A wave of complex emotion washed over me, not victory, but a profound, aching sadness. His daughter's simple act of love had been the one thing that could penetrate his armor of resentment. His confession, his betrayal of Thorne, wasn't for me. It was for her. Mr. Davies reviewed the new evidence. The USB drive contained the entire unedited email chain between Kalen and Thorne, a complete blueprint of their conspiracy from its inception. It was the final, irrefutable nail in their coffin. The judge's ruling was swift and absolute. She issued a permanent injunction against the deepfake video, ordering all platforms to remove it. She referred Rex Thorne and his law firm to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation into conspiracy, defamation, and perjury. She referred Kalen's case for consideration of similar charges. My name was cleared. My honor restored. As we filed out of the courtroom, I could feel Kalen's eyes on me, pleading. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. My gaze was fixed on the crumpled purple paper crown I held in my hand. Justice had been served. The war was won. But there was no exhilaration of victory. There was no triumphant celebration. There was only the quiet, heavy truth that the price of this war was a family, irrevocably broken, its fragments scattered by a storm of our own making. In the weeks following the hearing, the storm passed, leaving behind a quiet, altered landscape. The machinery of justice, once set in motion, moved with inexorable force. Rex Thorne was disbarred and faced a slew of criminal charges that would likely occupy the rest of his life. Kalen, in a plea deal, agreed to intensive psychological therapy and signed over his entire portion of our father's inheritance to a trust fund for Alara, to be managed by an independent trustee until she turned 25. Justice, in its cold, procedural way, had been served. But I felt no sense of triumph. The aftershocks of victory were not celebratory fireworks, but a deep, resonant quiet. It wasn't a feeling of winning, but of course correction. Of a fractured bone that had been reset, painful but necessary, leaving the limb stronger at the broken place. My objective had never been revenge. In my mind, accountability and compassion could coexist as long as truth was honored. The war, however, is never truly over. It only changes form. One evening, a plain white envelope with no return address appeared in our mailbox. No stamp, meaning it had been hand-delivered. Inside, there was no threatening note, only a single, grainy photograph. It was of Corb and me, walking our dog in a nearby park, taken with a long-range lens. The message was clear, a silent whisper from the remnants of Thorne's network. We are still watching. A year ago, a threat like this would have sent a jolt of fear through me. Now, I simply looked at it, my heart rate steady. I handed the photo to Corb. We didn't speak of fear. We spoke of protocol. He made a call to Army counterintelligence, and our security detail was quietly enhanced. We chose vigilance over fear, a conscious decision to live in a state of preparedness, not paranoia. The world would always have its threats. The only thing you could control was your response. A week later, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Kalen's number. I let it ring 4 times before answering, my own small final act of control. His voice was hesitant, stripped of all its former arrogance. He didn't offer an apology. Perhaps he knew no apology could suffice. Instead, he said something far more powerful. Elara, he began, his voice cracking slightly. She keeps asking when Aunt Noli is going to tell her the stories about Grandpa. I was silent for a long moment, the unspoken weight of our shattered history hanging between us. The old Noli would have refused, would have held onto the righteous anger as a shield. But I was no longer that person. The battle had changed me. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't about absolving the other person. It was about unshackling yourself from the weight of their sins. All right, Kaylin, I said, my voice soft but clear. This weekend, I'll come over this weekend. Our relationship was a ruin, a city leveled by war. But in his words, and in mine, a single, fragile bridge was being built across the rubble. Not for him, not even for me, but for Elara, for the future. The story ends, as it began, in a place of solemn honor. Not a church this time, but a place far more personal. I drove to Arlington National Cemetery in the pre-dawn darkness, the sky a soft, bruised purple. The air was still and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and cut grass. I walked alone through the silent, endless rows of white marble headstones, each one a testament to a life of service. They stood in perfect, disciplined formation, an army at rest. I stopped before my father's grave. His name was carved into the stone with a simple, profound dignity. I wasn't wearing my uniform. I wore a simple civilian coat. I was not a general this morning. I was just a daughter. I thought of a passage from the Bible he used to read to me before my deployments, his voice a steady comfort against my fear. It came back to me now, not as a memory, but as a living truth. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. From my coat pocket, I took out the small, crumpled paper crown that Elara had made. I smoothed out the creases as best I could and placed it gently at the base of the cold, white stone. It was a splash of vibrant purple against the stark white, a small, hopeful testament to the innocent love that had, in the end, been the most powerful weapon of all. I stood there as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the hills, illuminating the rows of silent sentinels. The long shadows of the night began to recede. I held the line, Dad, I whispered to the quiet stone, the words carried away on the morning breeze. I held it. The promise had been kept. The sun rose higher, promising a new day, a day of peace I'd fought for, and finally, had found. My journey to that dawn at Arlington was long and fraught with battles I never expected to fight. But I know my story is not unique. It is a testament to the fact that honor is not the absence of attack, but the courage to stand up again, stronger, at the broken places. If this story has given you a measure of strength or solace, I invite you to stay. Subscribe to the Chosen Revenge channel, where we believe every story of resilience deserves to be heard, and every survivor deserves to know they are not alone.